Welcome to the Season for Nonviolence, hosted by the Institute for Holistic Health Studies at San Francisco State University. I'm your co-host, Amber Yang, the Restorative Justice and Wellness Coordinator for a Bay Area school district, along with Ken Burrows, the core faculty member and founder of the Holistic Health Learning Center at San Francisco State. Join us for 80 days of practice celebrating the legacy of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. in applying nonviolent principles of love, wisdom, and cultural transformation to daily life. Today's focus is on the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. in cultivating peace in a violent world, and we play this on April 4th, which marks the day of his passing. For today's theme, our program has the pleasure of hosting Kazu Haga, founder of the East Point Peace Academy and teacher and practitioner of nonviolence, restorative justice, meditation, community organizing, and movement building in prison, school, and community settings. We'll hear from him in just a moment, but just to call in a part of his book, Healing Resistance, where he writes that we need a movement that is, in Dr. King's words, nonviolent but militant, and as dramatic, as disassociative, as disruptive as attention-getting riots, yet also understands that the goal of such a movement is to bring humanity together and heal, as his friend Reverend Samantha Wilson calls healing with teeth. Here's Kazu Haga. All right, so welcome, Kazu. Thank you for being a part of our program virtually this year. This interview in particular is a special one as it touches on the legacy of the man who helped catalyze the power of nonviolent activism during the civil rights movement and beyond. And I think I see you, Kazu, as one of the primary thought leaders in nonviolence. And actually, you just wrote a book, Healing Resistance, A Radically Different Response to Harm. This is a powerful book for me, that really speaks to the power of nonviolence in our current times. In a way that isn't just intellectual too. So I really love the embodied nature you put into this book. So love foregrounding that.
So much.
Yeah. And you have a committed life to studying nonviolence. What events in your earlier life led you to this passionate focus?
Yeah, I think there's always two kind of things that happen in my life that I point to as things that catalyzed my lifelong kind of path. One is when I was 17 years old. At the time, I was living in Massachusetts, and I was not in a good place in my life. I dropped out of high school a couple of years prior to that. My family life was kind of falling apart, and I was doing nothing productive with myself.
Mm.
And there just happened to be a Japanese Buddhist monastery near where I lived, and the folks at that monastery are really committed to nonviolence and social change work as part of their spiritual practice. It's a Buddhist order called Nipponzan Myohoji. And they were about to launch this year-long walking pilgrimage where they were going to walk from Massachusetts down the coast of New Orleans to retrace the slave route, and then eventually through the Caribbean and into Africa to essentially reverse the Middle Passage and to talk about the legacy that slavery left behind on this country and to begin the process of healing from that lineage. And I heard about this thing like a week before it started, knew nothing about Buddhism, knew nothing about slavery, just it was a total kind of newbie to any of this, never done any activist work, but I was just bored. So I told my mom, like, it sounds cool, I'm going to check it out for a week. And I ended up leaving home for a year and a half. Ended up spending the first 6 months walking to New Orleans. And then one of the nuns from the order invited me to go to one of their monasteries in Nepal. So I spent a year living in their monasteries throughout India, Nepal, Sri Lanka. And so that was my first introduction to nonviolence, to social change work. And then about 10 years later, I had been doing nothing but social change work from that moment. So 10 years into this path, I thought I had some idea of what the word nonviolence meant. But then I ended up taking a 2-day workshop on a philosophy called Kingian Nonviolence, Conflict Reconciliation, which was developed out of the teachings of Dr. King. And in those 2 days just completely changed my life. And then 3 months after that, a young man named Oscar Grant was shot and killed by the BART police, the transit police here in Oakland, just down the street from where I live. And I ended up being involved in the organizing that happened in response to that. This was back in 2009. And during the course of that campaign, like my intellectual curiosity of nonviolence that I just discovered in this 2-day workshop just landed in my body, and I just knew I had to understand it at a deeper level. And so yeah, both the going on that walking pilgrimage and spending a year in monastery, as well as learning about Kingian nonviolence,
Mm.
and organizing in the Oscar Grant movement are the two things that really catalyzed my work. And you know, the book that I just wrote, Healing Resistance, is about the lineage of Kingian nonviolence and the teachings. So
Mm. Wow.
yeah.
And, when people think of nonviolence, they often think of its founder, Mahatma Gandhi, and his work to unite the whole nation of India to call for independence from British occupation. Yet you've studied Kingian nonviolence, as you shared, based on the teachings of Martin Luther King. How is Kingian nonviolence unique?
Well, I think nonviolence itself is as ancient as it probably started in the Big Bang in some way. I like to think like it's just a universal law of nature about how
Mm.
harm happens and how it's reconciled. And
Yeah.
Gandhi was one of the first people, in Dr. King's words, to utilize kind of the love ethics of Jesus
Mm.
in a social realm. Kingian nonviolence to me is, so there's Dr. King's philosophies of nonviolence, and out of that, two elders named Dr. Bernard Lafayette and David Jensen created this training curriculum called Kingian Nonviolence. And the Kingian curriculum does such an incredible job at
Mm.
codifying some of the core elements of nonviolence. You know,
Mm.
nonviolence is such a big word, and it's hard to really put into just a few words what nonviolence means. The Kingian curriculum does the best job that I've ever seen of really explaining to people what the heart of nonviolence is. And so it's been super helpful for me to just have common framing and common language around what we mean when we use the word nonviolence.
That's powerful. Something that I've noticed, as someone who has practiced nonviolence in my own work at the high school doing restorative justice work, but also in my own meditations and in my own conversations with others, when people are like, "What do you do?" and "What are you passionate about?" and nonviolence often comes up. I think it's really beautiful to talk about nonviolence, to talk about the power of it and the vision of it. And in practice, though, more challenging and more nuanced. You practice nonviolence in prison settings, in schools, in community settings. What is a powerful example of nonviolence that you've witnessed or were a part of where you were actually putting it into practice?
You know, I like to think that nonviolence has applications in our own personal lives as well as in systemic change work. And
Mm.
so personally and interpersonally, there's a story that I'll never forget. It's several years ago now. I had the privilege of facilitating a dialogue between this man, Richard, who is currently incarcerated in Folsom State Prison,
Mm.
and a woman named Cynthia.
Mm.
About 20 years prior to that dialogue, Richard took the life of Cynthia's son.
Mm.
And 20 years later, Cynthia reached out to us and wanted to be in dialogue
Wow.
with the men that took her son's life. And so, you know, it took, I don't know, probably about 6 months of prep, just talking to both of them individually before we brought them together. 6 months being a relatively short amount of time for some a dialogue of this kind of scale.
Mm.
But I'll never forget that day when, you know, we went into the prison and we sat Cynthia down, and I went and got Richard. And as he turned the corner and saw Cynthia in the room, he just completely broke down.
Mm.
And Cynthia opened up her arms and they embraced in this hug that felt like it lasted an hour, you know, and then they just talked for the next 6 hours. And there was this moment where
Wow.
Cynthia was holding Richard's hands as he was crying. And Cynthia said, you know, I had a dream that I needed to hold your hands because these are the hands that took my son's life. And I
Wow.
needed to have a different relationship with them.
Wow.
And there's just like so much magic that happened that I just found myself sitting in this room like, what did I do to deserve the honor of being able to witness such magic? And to me, that's the power of nonviolence, right? Like I can run through all six of the Kingian nonviolence principles and really see clearly how it applies in this context. You know,
Mhm.
the first principle, I'm not going to go through all six of them, but the first principle is nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. And
Mm.
the courage that both of them had to have to be in that dialogue, Dr. King talks about the beloved community, which is the second principle of nonviolence, which is really a commitment to reconciliation, right? And forgiveness. And so that's an incredibly powerful story to me of the
Mm.
possibilities of nonviolence, and the healing that it can create. And then on the systemic change level, like I think a lot about, again, the privilege that I had to spend some time at Standing Rock when that struggle was going on,
Mm-hmm.
and just the elders there constantly reminding us that when we go into town to engage in those direct actions, we're going to a ceremony, we're going to a ritual of healing. So remember that, because it's so easy when like the police are there and people are chanting and the energy escalates
Mm.
to get into this us versus them worldview. And
Mm.
the elders were constantly reminding us, like, you're going there for a ceremony, you're going there for healing. And I think that entire movement, Standing Rock, was deeply, deeply impactful and inspirational to me.
Wow. You just dropped two powerful examples that I each want to just like process. It reminds me of that quote. I forgot who said it, but it's the quote says, "Healing happens in the slow lane."
But the 20 years of work that they both did individually, both of them, they're both indigenous, and they both continued to talk about the importance of their spiritual practice
Mm.
to get them to the point where they were when I first met them, so.
Right. Wow. Just to speak to your experiences at Standing Rock, it's so powerful that they were really setting this intention of it being a sacred space. And as you are saying, and I've been to protests, there is such a seduction to violence when you really see the injustice clearly.
Yeah.
And you have this idea about these people who are decision makers who you feel responsible for this harm. And it's really easy to be caught up in that seduction. And I was talking to a bunch of my colleagues and friends about the social justice spaces we're involved in. And, I asked them, like, what words came up to describe your process? And some words that came up were not just the usual words you hear, like solidarity, empowerment, voices heard, but actually, what came up was walking on eggshells,
Mm.
toxic, rage, fear of saying the wrong thing. And in your book, you talk about the woke activist culture that means to heal and yet sometimes actually harms. Can you share more about that? What is the role of nonviolence in healing the harm from woke activist culture and social justice spaces?
Yeah, I like to think about the difference between woke and awakening. To me,
Mm.
woke feels very black and white, like you're either woke or you're not.
Mm.
And nothing in this world is ever black and white. Like we're all ignorant about so many things, and we are all in the process of awakening. A lot of the energy and the intention behind that kind of thing is something that we need to honor, right? Like a lot of it comes from a desire to see change happen in the world and a desire to bring accountability to the world,
Mhm.
and that's important. But I think beloved community is, and I write this in my book, like the beloved community is not just about loving the people that are easy to love, right? It's about learning to love the people that are difficult to love, and it encompasses every living organism on this planet and beyond, right? So how do we move towards a world where no living organism would ever question their sense of belonging? And how do
Mm.
we create powerful movements that have the assertiveness and the power to demand change and yet never give up on the dignity of every human being?
Mm.
um, and so I think it's really important that we in nonviolent movements hold reconciliation and the healing of relationships as our long-term goal, that we never lose sight of that.
Mm.
And that we never lose sight of the fact that what we're trying to do ultimately is to create healing and to create a world where all people can achieve their full potential and where all people can truly feel their sense of belonging.
Mm.
And I think, a lot of why that kind of culture happens too, which I'm both like scared of and critical of, but also have a lot of empathy for, is
Yeah.
because it's coming from a place of trauma, right? Like I've been in this work for a long time, and I really did notice something shift in 2016 when Trump came into office. Um, and the next 4 years was like really traumatizing for a lot of people, for
Mm.
all of us, right? Like for those of us on the political left, not only all of the policies that were happening and the cultural norms that were being built and the resurgence of white supremacy and all of these things. And then we go out into the streets to try to resist those things, and then the police violence that happens and all of that. But also for people on the political right who were so-called inspired by Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who works with trauma, I look at Donald Trump and I see someone who's so deeply traumatized, and he's just operating from a place of trauma. And I have a feeling that witnessing someone in such a public space operate so obviously from a place of trauma just triggered and woke up the trauma of an entire nation. And I don't know that people were inspired by him as much as there was this weird like trauma bonding that was happening. And so I think like everyone in the country was traumatized, and I don't want to put it all on Trump because there's also like the climate crisis and there's the pandemic, of course, and there's all these things, and we're all operating from a place of trauma. And when you're operating from a place of trauma, nonviolence becomes very difficult, right? And that sort of black, white, us versus them, you're not woke, I'm woke, like all of that is like what happens in our brains when we don't have access to our prefrontal cortex, which is what happens when our trauma is triggered, right? And so I think the role of trauma healing and grief work and things like that, emotional regulation tools, we really need to begin to bring that into nonviolent spaces. So that the part of our brain that is responsible for empathy and nuance and creativity and all of these things that nonviolence requires can be fully activated and engaged. And so I think the work of trauma healing is really important in the work that we do today.
Trauma is like the equivalent of someone flailing and about to drown, and there's a sense of helplessness and powerlessness that comes from it. And in spaces in which power under was the only dynamic, where oppression was something you experienced constantly on the daily, the powerlessness that emerges creates this rage. What does it mean to channel our rage constructively?
That's right.
And so he talks about the skillful means needed to be able to see your goal. If your goal is to bring peace to the community, if your goal is to bring healing to those impacted by the criminal justice system, that is the goal to achieve. And yet sometimes with trauma, what happens is that the goal becomes, I matter too, see me, see my pain. I think that nonviolence really speaks to, this is the vision, right? And we're willing to suffer in response to this vision that we carry for all of us.
I'm actually working on a second book right now, which is really about the intersection of trauma work and nonviolent resistance work.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because I think, when we traditionally think of nonviolence trainings, we imagine doing role plays and hassle lines and learning how to do blockades and things like that. But I really do think that in addition to that, we need to be learning emotional regulation tools, and we need to be doing grief rituals and rage rituals and long-term trauma healing work. And that without that, a commitment to nonviolence is really difficult.
There's a quote that says, we as a society are living in a state of post-traumatic shock.
Yeah.
And to not address the role of trauma in our own internal healing is to not help us see what it's like in our own personal lives, to feel the social division, the oppression within ourselves. Adrienne Marie Brown, she had this beautiful 3-minute talk about her pleasure activism book, and she's like, well, if I want healing for all Black women, I really need to go in and see what it's like to feel that happiness for myself. And that means that I have to look at all the layers of oppression and division and hate that I have built towards myself to even understand how those systems can be replicated out in the world.
I've really learned a lot from my own healing journey. And one of the things that we're exploring a lot in our work now is really looking at nonviolent resistance and direct action work and organizing and social change work as trauma healing modalities happening at scale, right? So like if we view nonviolent direct action as a healing modality that is just happening at a different scale, then could we reimagine what movement work could look like? Because I think ultimately, yeah, we're trying to bring that sort of like personal healing journeys that many of us have been on to public spaces and doing it collectively at scale, right? In the same ways that like I've had to have a lot of really painful, difficult conversations about my early childhood trauma. The
Mm,
United States needs to have very painful, difficult conversations about its early childhood traumas. And
yeah.
how do we use nonviolence as a way to create spaces that are courageous enough and safe enough for the country to talk about that, right? And the pilgrimage that I went on when I was 17, in essence, was an attempt to do that, right? To open up those conversations. And so yeah, I think ultimately what we're trying to do is bring healing to public spaces. And so yeah, the importance of trauma is and trauma healing can't be understated.
Just engaging with people so that we're really being mindful about how we're engaging across these topics, and I think it's a perfect time because if you look at our current times, cancel culture, not to mention like post-COVID aftermath, the haves and have-nots is like increasing, and the division between people amongst those who are vaccinated, those who aren't. There's a lot of violence there. And also just the global war we're seeing right now with Russia and Ukraine. There's just so much to say about that. So, how do you see the legacy of Martin Luther King? How do you see nonviolent activism taking an active part in healing the current times that we're living in right now?
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes by Dr. King, of which I have like 50, so I don't know if I can say like this is one of my favorite quotes, just because like everything that he said is one of my favorite quotes. But one time he said that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. And I think there's a lot of ways in which that quote encapsulates the potential of nonviolence,
Mhm.
because so often, even people who are in so-called nonviolent movements, like we really focus on the love aspect of it and loving all people and loving our enemy and even the people who are causing harm, to slow down enough to know that they also have a story, and
Mm,
to know that like as they are causing harm, they're also destroying their own souls in the process, and to have compassion for that, I
mm,
think is really important. And if that's all we're doing, we don't have the power to stop the systems that are causing the harm from continuing to cause harm, right? And at the same time, if we're only focused on harnessing power through actions, organizing, and so-called nonviolent action, even, one of the things that I've noticed is that like we are living in times of such escalated forms of violence
mm,
that Michael Nagler teaches us that like as the violence escalates, our nonviolent response to that also has to escalate,
mm,
right?
mhm,
Which is why filling out a petition is not the appropriate response for the movement for Black Lives, because the violence that they're responding to is so escalated that occupying buildings and taking over highways is probably the more appropriate response, right?
mm,
But one of the things that I've noticed is that the more we escalate our tactics and our response system to violence, the more we tend to escalate this black white worldview and this us versus them
mm,
worldview. And to me, it's that us versus them worldview that is at the heart of what is destroying this planet, right? And it's this delusion of separation. It's this delusion that I can somehow receive liberation by defeating you and by overpowering you. Um, and so love and power alone are never going to get us to where we need to go. And I think
mm,
Dr. King's legacy is someone who reminded us towards the very end of his life. He
mm,
was organizing the Poor People's Campaign, and he said that we need a nonviolent movement that is as disruptive and as dislocative as a riot, and
mm,
that he was trying to organize an encampment, the Poor People's Campaign on the National Mall, and to use that encampment as the hub of operations to cripple the entire infrastructure of Washington, D.C. to demand billions of dollars a year in reparations.
mm.
And to remember that he was that kind of revolutionary,
Yeah.
right? And that he was a militant,
Mm,
and that he never laid down his commitment to nonviolence and to building beloved community and to bringing healing, right? Like healing wasn't language that was around much during his time, but that's what he was trying to do, right? Is to heal relationships and to heal people and communities. And so I think the legacy of nonviolence is the potential that is there at that intersection of love and power. Um, so yeah, that's what I hope to that we can cultivate more and more of.
When you're talking about like Martin Luther King, I think part of why he became a huge threat wasn't just his work with racial justice, but he started speaking up about the Vietnam War and was
Yeah,
like, wait a sec, what's going on here?
and
And
about capitalism and
right. And he was like the very desire for peace and well being and for justice and human rights that we want for people in America. These people, these poor children in Vietnam, what about them? He's inviting us all to remember our interconnectedness, that our suffering is so tied to the suffering of others. The work becomes more powerful when we see this as a whole paradigm shift. It's like it's not just for one specific race, but really all races, and to really pay attention to that, to hold that as this larger vision.
I really believe in dual truths, and that conflicting truths can be 100% true at the same time. And so on the one hand, it can be dangerous to go down the and have the conversation of like, let's talk about the human race, because that argument is oftentimes used to shut down discussion about the ways in which specific people are suffering in very specific ways. And
Yeah,
that's important to have those conversations and distinctions. And there's also the flip side of that, which is that, Dr. King was very clear that the civil rights movement wasn't an issue between Black people and white people, it was an issue between right and wrong.
yes.
And there's an elder from the civil rights movement who once said that the civil rights movement was a battle for the bodies of Black folks and the souls of white folks. And
Mm,
there's an acknowledgement that when there's a system of injustice, like racism or poverty or whatever, everyone is hurt by that. Right?
mm,
Nobody, like, yes, there's privilege. And again, that's the flip side of it, right? We need to be able to talk about privilege. And we also need to acknowledge that white people have their souls destroyed by white supremacy. And
mm,
as a cisgendered man, like I have been wrecked by patriarchy. Right.
mm,
So like the work of undoing patriarchy isn't something that I do for, oh, like all these poor women who are being harmed, let me save them. Like it's for myself as well.
mm.
And so I think there is a way in which we need to remind ourselves that these systems of violence hurts everybody. And it's not this like Black people over here, white people over here. So yeah, it's a complicated discussion where there's truth on both sides.
I feel like you and I are both quotesters because in response, I have another quote.
Love
um,
quotes. Yeah.
this yoga teacher, I went to a yoga retreat in Costa Rica many years back. I remembered she had us in like in bow pose, which is like so vulnerable because your whole like in your back muscles are all engaged and you feel like you're about to throw up. and she's like, just notice the tension, and yet also the more you relax, the less tension. And so she was like, the closer you get to paradox, the closer you get to truth.
Mm,
And I think that our ability to be with paradox,
yeah.
to be with the fact that one truth is so whole, but not by itself.
Yeah, I love that quote. The closer you get to paradox, the closer you get to truth. The more we're traumatized, the less we're capable of holding paradox, right? Because everything becomes black and white in trauma
Yeah,
when we're
right on.
activated. So yeah, no,
Yeah.
I also have a yoga teacher who would sometimes put me in these positions where I can barely breathe, and then she's like, "Okay, now just relax into that for 2 minutes." And I'm like, I can't even breathe, and you want me to try to relax? But it's true that the more we relax, even when we're struggling, the less it hurts. And there is like it's
Yes.
paradoxical, but I think there's a lot of parallels in nonviolence to that. That oftentimes when we see harm and injustice, our tendency is to tighten, right, to protect ourselves and to feel powerful. But when we tighten, that's also a sign of trauma activation. And so, can we go into the world and face injustice in a way where we're actually relaxed and calm and remembering to breathe in each moment? It's a paradox.
I think that's why people sense a spiritual dimension to the crises we're in, because we really have to do that inner and outer work.
Definitely.
And then also the spiritual dimension of, wow, this old world of division, domination, violence is dying. And we're seeing it dying because you're seeing how many things are erupting in our face. So, what is this new world? As John A. Powell says, he said, to be a bridge is hard because you're going to be walked on.
Mm.
to be the bridge.
Wow.
And sometimes you'll be stomped on.
Mm.
And sometimes people will be all over you, and yet this is what is needed. So even though sometimes you get stomped and walked on, you are paralleling two worlds and healing our society in the process. It's such a beautiful thing to reach out and feel this larger network of good people doing beautiful things. Fred Rogers, he was saying that his mom, he's like, "Mom, what do I do when times get so hard?" He was like, "Look for the role models, look for the good people." So I see you as one of that for me in my personal life with reading this book and sharing it with my students, but also in just all the lives you've touched already so far. So thank you for being here today.
Well, likewise, thank you for the work that you're doing.
Yeah, that's awesome.